This video is the STEM connection video. We're going to look at how simplifying radicals and buying a television relate. When you buy a television and you ask for something kind of like, hey, can I buy a 50-inch screen? What are you actually asking for? Well, when you buy a TV, they actually measure it by the diagonal. So if you look at this picture right here, what you're looking at is what they would measure it by. So when you say, I would like to buy a 50-inch screen, this is what they're actually measuring. TVs are also created by what we call an aspect ratio. Most TVs follow one of two types of aspect ratios. When you look at an aspect ratio, it's basically a ratio between the width and the height of the TV. When we look at trying to find something like the diagonal, you can actually go back to what you learned about Pythagorean theorem. Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Basically, it's the two legs that make the right angle, and then that's going to equal the hypotenuse, or in this case, the diagonal of the TV. So when we buy a television, this television that you're looking at right now is one that I actually think I used when I was a little girl. This is an older model, and this particular model actually uses a 4:3 aspect ratio. That means that our width is 4 by height of 3 in some kind of ratio. So if we looked at this here, in this television screen, there's your width and there's your height, and whatever x represents, that's basically the same x you would use for both the width and the height using this particular ratio. So let's say that we've got our Pythagorean theorem, or in this case, we're going to use it to find our diagonal. And let's suppose that we're going to make x equal to 2 inches. What would that make the width? Well, 4 times 2 inches would be 8 inches. What would that make the height? 3 times 2 inches would be 6 inches. So here we have our width and our height of this TV. And now that we have them, we could technically plug this into our formula at the top to try to figure out how long is that diagonal. So if we look at d squared equals our width squared, or 8 squared, plus our height squared, or 6 squared, 8 squared really means 8 times itself, and 6 squared really means 6 times itself. So if we simplify this one more step, 8 times itself is 64, and 6 times itself is 36. The next step we'd want to do is add these two numbers together. So 64 plus 36 will give us 100. So our d squared equals 100. The next thing that we want to do is get rid of that square. Well, the inverse of squaring something is square rooting. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. When we take the square root of d squared, it leaves us with d. When we take the square root of 100, you have to think what number times itself gives us 100. In this case, it's going to be 10 inches. So if we had a TV that had a width of 8 inches, a height of 6 inches, the diagonal measure would be 10 inches. So you'd be walking into the store saying, I'd like a 10-inch TV. Well, there's another TV that we can actually buy, and this TV is going to be a TV that actually uses an aspect ratio of 16:9. When we have a 16:9 TV, this is becoming more commonly used, especially with HD TV programs being out. This means that if we had our width here, it's going to be 16 times some number, and that number is also going to be multiplied by 9 to get our two dimensions for this TV. So I've got a question for you. Which aspect ratio is better to use in the manufacturing of televisions? Well, let's suppose that we have an aspect ratio of 4:3. And we're just going to make this with a couple charts here. One where we're comparing 14:3 and one where we compare it to 16:9. And what we're looking at here is, let's just look at a couple different dimensions that we could use for the TV and figure out what would the diagonal be. In other words, what would you go to the store and order when you say, hey, I want a 50-inch TV? What is that diagonal? So if we're dealing with an x value here of 1, and we're going to start with the 4:3 aspect ratio TV, that means we're going to be using 4 times 1. So our width in this case is going to be 4. And it also means we're going to do 3 times that exact same number. 3 times 1 is 3. So we have a TV that would be basically 4 inches by 3 inches, and we want to know the diagonal. So we can actually find the diagonal for this TV by using Pythagorean theorem. If we use Pythagorean theorem like we did on the previous set of slides, then we would find that the diagonal is 5. Well, we can also do the same thing for an aspect ratio of 16:9. Let's say that the width is 16x, and x is going to be 1. 16 times 1 is 16. That means our width would be 16, and 9 times 1 is 9, so that means our height is going to be 9. So if we wanted to use, again, that Pythagorean theorem, or our diagonal squared equals the width squared plus the height squared, we would find that the diagonal is going to be square root of 337. So what I want you to do now is pause this video. I want you to take a moment and I want you to find out what would these TVs look like if x was a value of 2 and if x was a value of 3. And when you have completed both of these charts, then you can resume the video. So now that you have made this x value 2, we've found that we have a width of 8 inches, a height of 6 inches, and the diagonal is going to be 10 inches. Now let's compare that to our 16:9 TV. In the 16:9 TV, our width would be 32 inches, our height would be 18 inches, and our diagonal would be 2 square root of 337 if you simplified that radical all the way. Well, let's look at what would happen if we actually had an x value of 3. What you see here before you is measurements. So looking at this information here, I'm going to ask the question again. Which aspect ratio is better to use in the manufacturing of televisions? Looking at the charts, which one would you go with? Well, when we deal with measurements and we're building things, it's usually better to use whole numbers. So we would be likely to say, hey, we need to use the 4:3 aspect ratio. But really, TVs are now changing and they're going away from this aspect ratio. Actually, most of the older TVs are using a 4:3 aspect ratio, but the new ones are no longer being manufactured this way. So, why would a television manufacturer change to a different aspect ratio? Well, consider the movies. When you go to the movies, you're actually using a 21:9 aspect ratio. And so that's going to be this screen here on the left. And so you're looking at this and it fills the whole screen. But then once the movie is done and they decide to put it in production, and so they can make it like DVDs and things like that we can use on our regular TVs at home, we're going to have to change the format. So we're going to change it to the format of 16:9 or our aspect ratio of 4:3. So which one's better? Well, looking at these three options here, we have a couple of things we notice. First, if we use this middle TV here, you'll notice here that we have a very large screen, but either parts are going to get chopped off or we're going to have a tiny little black strip above and below on the TV. If you look at the one at the right, we're going to have even more of our movie part chopped off. Or we're going to have even bigger black strip on the top and the bottom of our TV. Another thing to consider is that now HDTVs are actually doing most of their filming in a 16:9 aspect ratio. That basically means that it's going to fit this TV in the middle and it's going to fit it appropriately. So again, if you convert this to our 4:3 aspect ratio, although the dimensions are great to create the TV and to create it so that we have accurate measurements when we're measuring and creating the TV, you're basically looking at a TV that's going to chop off some of your picture. And so since the majority of the movie industry is going to convert to this 16:9, and since HDTV is actually going to start using it, my question comes back to, well, which one's better to use? Which aspect ratio is better to use in the manufacturing of television? Well, let's go back. If it's accuracy and measurement and we want to build the TV and we want to stick to whole number measurements, which we know are much more precise and easier to use when we create TVs, then we're going to want to use the 4:3 aspect ratio. However, when you consider that we're going to be converting movies and we're going to be converting things to HDTV from now on, because that seems to be the popular way to go right now, most of the televisions are going to actually use a 16:9 aspect ratio. So really, this kind of comes down to your opinion. Is it better to have accurate measurements when we create the TV? But then, are you going to sacrifice what is going to be more important to the audience, where they get to see the fuller picture? So, the question is, really, which one's more important to you? Thank you for watching our STEM connection using simplifying radicals and buying a television.